Welcome to the Salty Nerd Podcast. I am your host, the Salty Nerd. We are starting episode 6 today, all about cinematic universes, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. I am here with my new co-host, Dusty. How you doing today, man?
Peachy Keen, Jelly Bean. Thanks for the invite.
All right. So you came up with this topic. I asked you if you wanted to be on the podcast, and you were excited about it. And I was like, okay, so what do you want to talk about? And the first thing you said was cinematic universes. Mm-hmm. What made you want to talk about that?
Because I think it is, at least in the last 15 years of film, probably the most significant change in the way that movies are developed and planned. Cinematic universes, for the most part, were inconceivable for the majority of movie history. It was too much of a risk. There were a lot of factors that you had to get perfectly right in order to have a successful film franchise. And you had to make sure that all of your actors, your screenwriters, your directors, your locations, funding, et cetera, were perfectly laid out over a span of at least a decade. And yet somehow the Marvel Studios group has been able to pull that off successfully. And another reason I want to talk about it was not just because of how unique it is in film history, but also because of the way it's affecting filmmaking in general. What is that moving towards? Haven't heard too much about this being discussed on other podcasts, so I figured, why don't we take the lead?
Right on. Sounds good to me. So I was talking to you before. The first thing I want to do is I want to get a real set definition of what a cinematic universe actually is. So there's a lot of huge franchises out there right now that it's kind of on the fence whether some people would argue that it is a cinematic universe, and personally I would argue that it's not. Best example I could think of right off the top of my head was Star Wars. Star Wars for the longest time has just been a franchise, and you've had your three main characters go together in each movie. They didn't have their own spin-off movies. They didn't have anything separated. They were always a trio. You had Luke, Han, and Leia, and then in the prequels you had Obi-Wan, Anakin, Padme, and a couple others. And they were never separated. They were always together. More recently, with the Disney regime over Star Wars, we're starting to get those spin-offs like Rogue One. But Rogue One, I would argue that there was no main characters in that movie that would be forwarded into other movies. Everybody died, except for a couple cameos from Tarkin and Leia and Vader.
Right. It was like a sci-fi Guns of Navarone.
Yeah, it was.
They're supposed to die at the end.
They're supposed to die at the end, and I think they should have, and I'm glad that they did. It was personally, it was one of my favorite Disney Star Wars movies. So I wouldn't consider that to be cinematic universe yet. Then Solo came out, and that's kind of the game changer, because Solo is a main character from the original trilogy who now has his own spin-off movie. So it's kind of retroactively turning it into a cinematic universe, but for me personally, I think it still should remain as a franchise, especially for this discussion specifically.
Well, that may change too, because if I understand correctly, they have a Yoda origin movie planned.
Oh God, I hope not.
They do. It's
oh no,
it's officially scheduled. There's a Boba Fett one.
I heard the Boba Fett.
Yeah. And I don't know if this has changed at all, but I remember when the Solo movie was first announced, the idea was that in between each, official Star Wars film, there would be like an individual character.
Yeah, the anthology films. Well, I think that's officially changed. It was either yesterday or today. Bob Iger did an interview with the Hollywood Reporter, and he took a bullet for Disney, took a bullet for the Lucasfilm Group, and he said, we've made some mistakes, and we've moved, I think, a little bit too... I'm not quoting him exactly, but he said we gave out too much too fast. He's like, we're going to kind of scale it back a little bit and focus more on the stories and give out better quality products, basically, is kind of what he was suggesting. Mm-hmm. So that plan that was true a couple of months ago, that might have changed now. Okay. We'll have to see what they're going to do going forward. I cannot fathom why they haven't made an Obi-Wan movie with Ewan McGregor. Ewan McGregor has said he's wanted to do one since after the prequels were over, and it was like it's a gold mine waiting for them to do it, and they just won't do it.
He's aged really well.
He has, yeah. He's getting closer and closer to the age that Obi-Wan would need to be for a standalone film, so they need to get on it quick.
It's not like Michael Keaton says he wants to, reprise the Batman role. I mean,
I'm down for that.
I
I want him to do did you ever watch Batman Beyond, the cartoon?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I want him to be the old Bruce Wayne.
The old Batman.
Yep. I want him to be the old Bruce Wayne, Michael Keaton back as Bruce Wayne, and then have some young,
I like
popular
that too.
kid as being Terry Maguire. I think that'd be perfect. Anyway, so the other one that's kind of on the fence would be the Jurassic Park series. We were talking about that. Jurassic Park, the first movie, it had your ensemble. You had Grant, Malcolm, and Sattler. And then the second movie was, arguably, it was Ian Malcolm's movie. And then the third movie was Dr. Grant's movie. So technically they have one character has their own movie, and then they come together as a group. It's kind of backwards because they came together as a group in the first one, and then they had their separate ones after that. But technically you could call that a cinematic universe. And now with Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard in these new movies where Malcolm has now made a cameo in the newest one. So, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that counts as being a cinematic universe yet, or is it still just a franchise?
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording. To me, it feels like it's still just a franchise because you don't have a standalone Ian Malcolm movie. You don't have a standalone Alan Grant background movie. I think if it expanded into one of those areas, where we get to learn more about the different characters individually, maybe it would be more of a film franchise. A shared universe. Because then you could justify that the Star Trek movies are a shared universe also, right? Because you have some that focus on Kirk's crew. Kirk and Spock are the primary characters. Then it turns into Picard and Data. And they're sort of recycling that again. So, I don't know. I guess if we're going by the definition that you came up with, which I agree with, that to have a cinematic universe, you need to have... it needs to be a mosaic of different individual stories that come together into an overall story and coalesce into these major event blockbusters.
I just thought of that. That's a good point because all of the Jurassic Park movies, they don't really have any kind of heavy impact on the previous one or the one that comes after. They're all kind of standalone. They don't really have any... There's a few things that kind of mesh together. They did like a little bit of a fan service in Jurassic World where they talked about the original park, but there's wreckage of the old one, but there's no like real defining moment. So anyway, continue. Go ahead.
Yeah, you didn't need to have seen the original Jurassic Park to enjoy it.
Yeah.
That's another defining characteristic also. I mean, it's very difficult to just jump into, for example, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 3/4 of the way through to Infinity War and just intrinsically know what's going on. As time has gone on, they've become more laden with heavy references to the other films. For example, Ant-Man, the first movie, had a long cameo from the Falcon. If you had not seen the Captain America movie, you would not know who the Falcon was.
That's a good point.
Or why he was in there. Spider-Man Homecoming, again, doesn't really work as a standalone movie because, you have Tony Stark in there, you have references to the Avengers and how he wants to be one of them.
And the relationship that he has is kind of predicated on seeing Civil War.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it kind of mimics the comics in that way too, if you read Marvel Comics at any point in or really any superhero comic book franchise, if you just jump into a storyline halfway through, you quickly learn that you have a whole bunch of back reading to do in order to catch up with the rest of the audience.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. So going forward, we're just going to call it what it is. We'll say that it has to have some kind of a cohesive plan from the start to be a cinematic universe where, like you said, you had each individual movie and then you have your team-up movie at the end. So going forward with that, I did want to give credit to Universal Studios for having the first ever technical cinematic universe because it's a little different because obviously they weren't really planning it back then. They did have Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein that all came out in the 30s. So 31, 32, 35. They were all kind of not necessarily supposed to be connected, but they were all within that same universe. And then that big crossover came in 1943 with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. And again, I don't know if it was their ultimate plan to have this done. I think they were just trying to capitalize on the hype behind their recognizable brand of these monsters. Like, oh, everybody wants to go see Frankenstein and Dracula and all these people. So, when I was doing the research for this, I found out that the Universal monsters went from these classic horror movies, and then as the dates went on into the 40s and 50s, they kind of became like the butt end of a joke. Like you started seeing them on Tonight shows.
Abbott and Costello films also.
Exactly. Yeah. So they kind of went off and they fell out of favor as far as the public opinion went after that, because they didn't really have that horror anymore. It was all just kind of a joke. So, but I did want to give them credit, because that was technically the first cinematic universe ever. They had these main characters in their own standalone films, and then eventually they'd come together. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and then House of Dracula had like all of them. And going forward, that's kind of like breaking the groundwork for it, like you were talking about. It's really hard to do that, and it's a lot of risk for studios. Well, they did it all the way back in the 40s and 50s.
And so, I don't think even if they wanted to make a shared universe at that time, they could have, because making a shared cinematic universe is predicated on a lot of things. You need to be able to plan films out, like...
Bring that mic closer to you, buddy.
Sorry. No first podcast. You need to be able to plan out, like I said earlier, every single resource, have it all accounted for far into the future. You need to be able to muscle your way into a definitive release slot during the year. You need to tie in all kinds of other media, which exists today that didn't really exist then, I mean, nowadays you have like the TV series, you can expand further out from the cinematic universe. You have novelizations that tie in. You have all kinds of other media give you this supplemental information that helps you enjoy other aspects of the shared cinematic universe. That's only really possible in this day and time. You could argue that with the studio system back then, where they had actors and screenwriters and directors under contract, they could have done something like that.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. This was more like a lightning in the bottle thing, where they're like, hey, people seem to still want to see these, so let's just figure out a way to mush them together.
And I did notice when I was doing my research, too, there's no real continuity between these characters. I think one of them died in the previous film, and then they brought him back in the next one, and they just acted like it never happened. So there's little things that you could say, oh, it's not really a cinematic universe, because they weren't really planning on it. Like, yeah, I'll give you that. It's not really, but I wanted to give them credit, because it's something that happened way, way back in the day when film was just getting into the public eye.
If I can jump in real quick as a brief aside, this is actually how shared universes in comic books themselves first started. The first one, if I understand correctly, was with DC Comics. It was post-war. All the soldiers are coming back from the war, and they're really not interested in reading the superhero comics that they had when they were growing up. What was more popular were mystery comics, crime comics, horror comics, things like that. And DC was desperate to boost its superhero line. So they said, well, let's see, what if we get all these different characters and we just smush them together into one team, and we just act like they inhabited the same world all along. Other than team-ups between Batman and Superman, they had never really done that before. So in a similar way, they actually unintentionally mirrored the Universal Studios monsters method here of just saying, well, let's just keep this train going as long as we can. Let's just pretend they all knew each other this whole time, and for some reason they never mentioned each other. But now we're going to make it official. The Wolfman has always known about Frankenstein and Dracula and so forth. It was the same thing DC did with the Justice League. So,
that's a cool little tidbit. Yeah. I kind of was. I know I'm supposed to be like this. Oh, you're a nerd. You're supposed to. I never really got into comic books. I was always more of a film geek. I did dive into some comic books if they were like really, really prominent ones. Dark Knight Returns, 300, some of the Frank Miller stuff I really liked, and then some of the Star Wars comics that has come out from Dark Horse. I like some of their stuff. So I dabble in comics, but I definitely don't have the knowledge that some people would consider a nerd should have as far as that goes. I'm more into movies and whatnot.
Let's not have nerd on nerd prejudice in this podcast.
It's all good. Okay, so all right, so let's just dive into it then. Marvel. So Marvel has kind of, I don't know. Would you say they perfected that art of creating this cinematic universe? I mean, Kevin Feige has done such a great job at doing this. He's taken that formula and he's banked on it. Every single movie that they put out makes money. They don't really have any flops. There's been some movies that have kind of not been great. Some of the fans are like, well, it's not my favorite, but it was still decent. It was still kind of entertaining. So do you think would you say that they perfected it?
I would say so. I mean, it's hard to compare them, because I guess you can now. We have DC to compare them to.
Yeah.
I would say they perfected it. I believe it was always their wish one day to do something like this, but if we think back to the state of the very first true Marvel movies in the early 2000s, late 90s, you had the Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, the first X-Men movies, The Punisher, Daredevil. Those were all standalone films, and there didn't really seem to be much of a plan around them other than, let's just get this out as quickly as possible. Let's get, who's next? Ghost Rider. We can do that pretty inexpensively. Let's get that out.
Yeah, Nick Cage's Ghost Rider.
Yeah. But there was no cohesive plan, and the reason why was because they were so desperate to just get them on the screen that they sold off the film rights to all these different companies. Mm-hmm. And only recently have they started reconsolidating all of them back together under their umbrella. But it wasn't until the first Iron Man movie that you started to see these small hints, if you were looking for them, towards having a shared cinematic universe.
And that was like the beginning of the end credit scene too. Like they've been doing. Right. I remember the Iron Man end credit scene had the general, God, what's his name from the Incredible Hulk, Thunder Ross. They had him at the end at a bar, and Tony Stark walked in and was talking about the Avengers, and I was like, oh man, that's crazy. Like these are in the same, like that's when I kind of realized, I'm like, oh, these movies are all connected.
We're putting a team together.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. Then you had Nick Fury, of course, talking about it.
Right, we're getting the Blues Brothers back together.
So that was the first hint, and that's, Jon Favreau did a great job. Iron Man 1 is still probably one of the most rewatchable Marvel movies. Yeah. You can go back and watch it anytime, and it holds up. It's a great story. You sit down and watch it all the way through, no problem. It's a great movie.
And that was quite a shift also from the earlier Marvel movies, because, again, if you look at the choices between the directors they had before, the screenwriters, the cast, it was sort of like, just get who's available and who's sort of okay, Mm-hmm. I mean, Sam Raimi, I think, was a good choice overall.
Yeah, little Spider-Man movies were decent. They were a little campy, but I think they were meant to be. I think that he was making a point of making them a little kind of goofy, campy, fun, lighthearted Spider-Man movie.
But once you got into Iron Man, the Hulk, and all those, you started to see this formula develop, where they wanted the flavor of individual directors, but they also had to meet a certain, I don't know, it was like a certain story structure. You know?
Yeah, they had the overarching point, like, okay, we want to get this character from point A to point B, do whatever you want in between, but make sure it starts here and ends here, kind of a thing. Like,
and again, that mimics the comic books in that you have the individual writers who have their own styles, the artists who have their own flares, their own storylines, but over them you have an editorial staff that is making sure that they can be as independent and as creative and individual as they want, so long as it remains within the structures of this box. Make sure the storyline leads into X event that we're having at the end of the year, and they successfully translated that into a film equivalent.
Yeah, I think they did great. Kevin Feige, I mean, I have a couple of the, some of the directors that I feel were probably the most influential and the ones that made some of the best movies in Marvel. Jon Favreau, of course, he made Iron Man 1 and 2. And then you had the director who did the first Captain America movie, which I thought was really well done. I would have liked to have seen Cap actually fighting in World War II a little bit more. They did like a montage of him doing a couple different battles with the what were his soldiers called? They were not soldiers of fortune. There was a name for them.
Oh, they were the Howling Commandos.
Yes.
They actually mixed together. That was the name of, so in the comics, Nick Fury was actually a World War II character.
Oh.
And his team was called the Howling Commandos. And through some, I forget, like he ingested some formula that made him immortal or something crazy like that, so he could live on into the rest of the 20th century.
Comic book stuff.
Yeah. But in the film universe, it doesn't work so well, so they just said, well, the Howling Commandos were separate from Nick Fury, and they fought actually under Captain America. That's how we're doing it in our universe.
That's the only criticism I really have of Captain America. I love the movie overall. Chris Evans was the perfect cast for Captain America. I loved how they made him super skinny at the beginning of the movie, and they just pasted Chris Evans' faces on somebody else's body. You got to give it to Marvel too. Even way back in the beginning of their franchise, when they were doing like the early CGI with different faces and de-aging and stuff like that. Like, they knock it out of the park. Nowadays they have 75-year-old Samuel L. Jackson playing in the 80s or 90s with Brie Larson, who it looks fantastic.
Is he really that old?
He's 70 at least.
God. Wow.
72 maybe. He didn't start acting until he was, I think, 40 or something.
40s,
yeah.
And get some of that moisture.
He's got a great skin, man. That guy does not age very much at all. But even, like I said, with Marvel, they did it with Michael Douglas and Ant-Man. They de-aged him for that one scene.
Yeah.
And then they did Robert Downey Jr. in Age of Ultron or Civil War, one of the two. But anyway, that's besides the point.
Mm-hmm.
Captain America was good. Joss Whedon helmed the first Avengers, the first official team up. I think he did really well with that, with working all these different characters, having them all on screen. You can't knock the guy. I mean, he did a really, really good job with that first Avengers movie. He got a little tired for Avengers 2. I know he made some comments that he didn't really want to do it again. It's a lot of work, a lot of stress.
You can tell in the film, too. It's a little bloated.
Yeah.
It's not as tight as it could be.
Yeah, he didn't work. Maybe he didn't. I don't want to say he didn't work as hard, but he just kind of maybe cut some corners or something. He did something different there where it didn't work quite as well.
I think Joss Whedon, too, the first Avengers movie coincided with Disney's purchasing Marvel. And I believe at that time they were kind of like, well, who do you want for a director? Before that, Jon Favreau, Joe Johnston, they were all directors that had experience, but they were mostly worked in smaller, like Jon Favreau made indie films, still does. And
he's helming the new Star Wars TV show now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, good for you.
$100
come a long way.
$100 million an episode or something
Wow.
like that.
Okay.
Crazy.
Remember him on Swing Kids. Joe Johnston, if I recall correctly, did a lot of like pulpy movies, like I forget, it was like a Mighty Joe Young remake, and I think with Charlize Theron. Right? Yeah,
and Bill Paxton.
Yeah.
I like that movie. I haven't seen it since I was a kid, but it's stuck in my head.
One of those puffy VHS cases.
Yeah.
And I believe he also helmed like a remake of The Wolfman.
Was it the 2010 one?
No, it was earlier. I want to say it's the one that had Jack Nicholson in it, Wolf. That might be wrong.
I'd have to look it up.
Anyway, they're guys that were established, but they weren't necessarily big household names. Mm-hmm. Joss Whedon was probably the biggest name they had at that time. Maybe not so much from a movie perspective, but from like a comic industry perspective. He founded Buffy the Vampire Slayer, wrote lots of comics, and I believe he was hired specifically because he was so comfortable with ensemble casts.
Yeah.
Easily can write a film with like 10 or more characters.
Yeah. And Joss Whedon wrote one of my favorite sci-fi shows was Firefly.
Oh, yeah.
I love that show. I don't think they should do it now. I think the time has passed, but I wish they would have continued that show because it's so much fun.
Yeah.
It's just fun. Like the comedy was perfect. Everything about it was great. And then, arguably the most influential, just knocked my mic over. The most influential directors would be the Russo brothers.
Oh, yeah.
Those guys knocked it out of the park. Once they got a hold of Captain America and Winter Soldier, and then they went on to do Civil War. They did Civil War, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Civil War, and then they did Avengers, Infinity War. They've just been one hit after another. All three of those movies are some of the best movies in the Marvel Universe.
By far. They were a true surprise because if I remember correctly, they primarily worked in TV before that, and their biggest credit was Arrested Development, which is like
they do little Easter eggs of that show.
Do they really?
Yeah. In I can't remember which movie it was. When they went to the collector's, it might have been Infinity War. When they go into the collector's big room or whatever, and he's got all those glass fish bowls or whatever that he keeps people in. There's one guy, it's a blue guy, a bald blue person with glasses, and I've never watched Arrested Development, so I just was watching a YouTube video and I found this out. That was a cameo from somebody that was from Arrested Development. He put him in a glass jar.
Tobias Funke.
And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So they do have that background with Arrested Development, so they went from that directly into these huge blockbuster movies.
But they, and maybe this comes from working in TV and having to get a tone exactly right for a TV show. They just nailed these tones with these different movies. Like The Winter Soldier was To me, it harkened back to those old '70s political
the
paranoia
political thriller.
thrillers.
Yeah,
like what is it, like the Parallax View, The Day of the Condor, and Infinity War. Again, total tonal shift. Epic sci-fi movie, apocalyptic movie, nailed that as well. Their ability,
they nailed that Thanos too. Like Thanos had little to nothing to do with this universe. He had a couple cameos, maybe not behind the scenes, after credit scenes, and then they went from that to arguably this was Thanos' movie. It was his beginnings, his motivation. Everything about that movie was pushed and directed from Thanos' standpoint.
Right.
And then he was just trying to accomplish his goal despite the Avengers being there.
Yeah, and I give him credit too, because the portrayal of Thanos has a lot of subtlety to it. It would have been easy just to write him off as
a big baddie.
A big baddie. He wants to kill everyone, but you sort of understand his perspective. For him, it's almost like a religious obsession where he's completely devoted himself to this goal, and the fact that everyone's trying to stop him and he experiences great personal cost, to him solidifies the fact that his mission is just, because otherwise there wouldn't be these many obstacles in his way.
Right.
There wouldn't be...
if it was easy, it wouldn't be worth doing.
It wouldn't be worth doing. It wouldn't be worth doing if you didn't have to sacrifice something. So therefore, what I'm doing is just. Now, if you pull it apart analytically, you can see his entire his entire philosophy falls apart.
Yeah,
it's
but
deeply flawed.
People believe in flawed logic all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just look on the news or look on Twitter once in a while, and you'd be like, that is some flawed logic that you're diving into head first. So it's not unrealistic to say that. And it gives that character... One of the criticisms of Marvel has been that their villains have always been a little one-dimensional and a little underwritten. And that's a valid criticism, and a lot of people have been turned off by it because they're kind of... Some customers of Marvel's movies have become so accustomed to that formula that they're not offering me anything new. I don't want to go back. Right. For me, I just like watching it. It's fun. It's a spectacle. I like the characters. I like the comedy most of the time. And but I can understand where people want to say, like, oh, it's the same stinking story every single time. It's just with a new character. Just put a new coat of paint on it, and it's a Marvel movie. Yeah. And I'm like, I get that. It kind of makes sense. They're definitely following a formula that works for them. I mean, those types of people are kind of in the minority. I hate saying that because people say that about me with Star Wars. Like, oh, you don't care about Star Wars. You're in the minority. But it's the same principle, or like the movie's making money. Marvel's not losing money on their movies, whereas opposed to Star Wars is kind of waning in their box office hits a little bit. But that's a different story.
But yeah, from a filmmaking perspective, though, it is a valid criticism. And they did shore that up in the most recent movies.
Yes. Yeah, they definitely. And that's one of the really great things about, I don't know if it's Kevin Feige who's paying attention to this kind of criticism when he's looking on social media and he's looking at reviewers and trying to figure out how to improve things. But almost every time that you have a misstep, Thor 2, Iron Man 3, those were movies that people were like, they were okay. They weren't exactly. Iron Man 3 made the biggest mistake with the Mandarin. Was that Iron Man 2? Yeah, Iron Man 3.
That was 3. The Mandarin was white.
The Mandarin was a white guy. They were like, what the crap? And then they had Ben Kingsley. They hired Ben Kingsley in this movie, and he was played off as some...
He was a joke.
It was a joke.
Yeah.
And people were mad, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of a dumb thing to do.
Well, it is. I mean, if you look at their casting for the villains, the antagonist was wonderful. Like you said, Ben Kingsley, Guy Pearce, Hugo Weaving.
Yep.
Who else was
Tom
there?
Hiddleston is Loki.
Tom Hiddleston was the only successful one that had some depth to him. Who am I forgetting? Christopher Eccleston, James Spader as Ultron.
As Ultron, yeah.
I think some people understandably saw a lot of wasted potential in what these actors could do. Like, you hired them for a reason, you didn't let them do it.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, if you look at the most recent installments leading up to Thanos,
they
really
around.
Fixed that.
Killmonger, a lot of people really loved Killmonger. He had some really good motivations behind him.
Yeah.
So they're taking that criticism and they're moving in the right direction, that's huge. That's something that for some reason some studios, Lucasfilm, don't really like doing. It's just really weird to me.
Right, it's like, well, people are going to see him anyway.
Yeah,
who cares?
Yeah, it's just kind of like holier than thou. Like, we know better than you. Just go watch our movies. You'll like them no matter what. Like, that's a kind of a bad mentality to have. With Marvel, you don't really see that.
That's a credit to Marvel also, because We have to remember they're making a lot of money now, but in order to, stay true to this idea of a shared cinematic universe and see it through to the end without compromise, they had to take on this massive risk that they wouldn't make any money, that the films would be a flop, that people would lose interest somewhere in the middle and peter off. There's a huge financial risk that they took.
Yeah.
And even to take this criticism of improving their villains, improving the type of storytelling they did with the Thor series, right? The Thor series was probably the blandest one, surprisingly.
Yeah.
They really fixed that with the third installment.
Some people would argue with that.
You think so?
I got in an argument with somebody. He's actually he's a good friend of mine. I met him on Twitter and we talk a lot. And his name is Roger. I don't know. I don't want to give away his last name, but anyway, he argued. He's like, that was a dumb movie. They took this character and they did a 180 with him. They made him into a comedic joke. Like everything to him was kind of like a laughable joke. Ha. He's just played everything off as a comedy now. It's not really a thespian, like Shakespearean type story like they could have gone. Like if they doubled down on the way Thor was portrayed in the first two movies, it was very, like I said, Shakespearean. It's a big play. It's kind of like that old school. I don't know exactly the word, how to correctly say it, but
even Kenneth Branagh was the director.
Yeah. So they had that direction, and if they would have maybe taken the time to write it a little bit more solidly in Thor 3, they could have done something like that. Really epic. Could have still been epic. It could have still been a lot of fun, but it could have had that same core value that Thor had in his first two movies. But instead, they were like, you know what? This isn't working. Let's give it to a guy who can make a comedy. People will laugh and love it. Look at the big spectacle with the big bright colors with Jeff Goldblum, who's really eccentric and doing this like
basically playing himself if he was an alien warlord.
Yeah. Let's put the Hulk in there. Let's give him some techno music. Let's just go all out. Like they really went in a completely different direction. I loved it. Yeah. I think it's great. I think it's a lot of fun to watch. I can sit down and watch it with my kids, and we could just look at it and have fun. And it's not bad in any way that I can think of, but people would argue that it's kind of just dumb. And they didn't follow through with the character the way they set him up.
Yeah. I would argue their portrayal of Thor in the third film was probably closer to the mythological figure of Thor, where he's almost like a stereotype of like negative masculinity. He revels in violence and sexuality and drinking and what have you.
He's a party man.
Yeah. He takes a joy basically in causing destruction. And I think they moved a little bit closer to that in his portrayal. I think it was necessary, too, to have that tonal shift leading into Infinity War, because this was the movie that dropped before Infinity War. And they needed to clinch your interest in Thor because he does play a major role in that movie.
Yeah, if Thor 3 would have flopped or if it would have not been good, then people wouldn't have cared nearly as much about Thor's arc in Infinity War. And he had a huge part to play, like I said. So that's a success story. Marvel's really knocking it out of the park. I'm digging everything that they're putting out. So some of the things I just want to put is trusting your directors. You hire these directors to do this thing. You have to trust them to do the job in their own specific special way that they want to do it. And then having that overall plan where you have everything meticulously planned out and everything leads into this one cohesive story. And that's something that a lot of studios that we'll talk about in a minute are kind of failing at doing. They're just like, they don't seem like they have a plan, or they're rushing it so much that they're not giving their characters time to breathe. So that'll segue right into the DCEU. Now, I want to say this at the beginning before we start bashing DC too much. I love the DC characters. I like DC characters more than Marvel characters. I want to see a good Superman movie. I want to see a really good dark Batman movie with, heck, put Ben Affleck back in there if he can do it. That's awesome. I loved him as in the role. And then Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot's really proven herself. I think with this next one that's coming out, I think we'll really see her move into the role 100% and really take it to a new direction. But just because we're going to be hitting on DC a lot in the next couple of minutes, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows I'm not hating on DC. I actually like DC. I just feel like they're taking this in the wrong direction.
Well, I think that it's good you mentioned that, because we're not hating on DC. It's that we love DC so much. We see so much of its potential. I mean, its characters are archetypes of popular culture in general.
Yeah.
They represent almost a continuation of these historic cultural I don't know, philosophies, mythologies into the modern day. And when you see what could be done with them, even as recently as Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, and then you see what, putting the cart before the horse, let's make a bundle of money first before we worry about the execution of this. It's just very, very disheartening.
Yeah. So starting out, now one thing I was talking to you before we started was everybody in our realm of the nerd, pop culture, movies, whatever, everybody knows who Kevin Feige is. Everybody.
Right.
You say Kevin Feige, you're like, oh, that's the dude who runs Marvel.
The Godfather,
The Godfather of Marvel, exactly. I had to look up who was running DC because I had no idea. I'm like, I was thinking about it when I was doing my show notes. I'm like, okay, we have Kevin Feige, but who's his other opposite? Who's the guy running DC? I'm like, I don't even know. So I looked it up real quick. There's two people, one of which had just been replaced. Jeff Johns, which you know some history behind, so we'll let you talk about him in a minute. Jeff Johns running DC, and then you also have John Berg. Now, John Berg was replaced in 2018, so fairly recently, by Walter Hamadah. I don't know his last name. Anyway,
he's listening to this right now and shaking his fist at the air.
Somebody who's a super DC fan is like, "You idiot! You don't even know what you're talking about." But he got replaced. I don't know anything about either of those two people. Honestly, I don't know anything about any of those three. But you know something about Jeff Johns, so let's talk about his backstory, I guess.
Jeff Johns is one of the most prominent mainstream superhero comic book writers of the 2000s, 2010s. He worked for both Marvel and DC, I think for some other labels as well. But he really cut his teeth with DC. In fact, he probably became the main writer for DC, you would argue. He helped sketch out their comic book universe's direction. Jeff Johns was famous for a series of comic book events called Rebirths. Now, before I explain what they are, I have to explain something about DC Comics. DC Comics, out of all these superhero comic book universes, is probably the oldest one. Stretches all the way back to the Second World War.
Superman came out in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
1930s.
Batman's 75 years old, or 76 or 7 by now.
Exactly.
He's just had his 75th anniversary, so
right.
This is a long history.
Now, the complications that arrive with having characters that were created so long ago is that, of course, time progresses, and you need to explain. Sometimes there's certain aspects of their backstory that you need to tinker with to bring them into the modern day. Mm-hmm. So, using the example of the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards and Ben Grimm, in the original 60s origin story, had met when they were, I believe, fighting along each other in the Vietnam War. So they had to change that, of course. And then they flew into space, the family that would become the Fantastic Four, because they were trying to get ahead of the Soviets in the space race. So just an example about how things need to be updated every now and then. You can imagine DC's headache when we get to the 1970s and they have decades full of characters and storylines that they somehow have to make work with each other. Mm-hmm. And so they had this idea where every so often they sort of trim off the fat. They had this event called the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and basically it was their first major event storyline in which all the characters from all the different histories of the DC universe came together to prevent this cataclysm from occurring, and that gave them the opportunity to kill off older characters, replace them with newer characters, and sort of streamline the entire universe. And they've done it 2 more times since then, when the universe became unwieldy.
It was the New 52, and then...
The New 52, right. That followed something called Infinite Crisis. And there was something called Final Crisis, which predated the current incarnation of the DC universe.
Okay.
So it's important to understand that because, like we mentioned before, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman are iconic characters, not just in comic books, but in pop culture and literature in general. And everyone recognizes Batman as Bruce Wayne, Superman as Clark Kent, etc., etc. So one of the big failings of the DC universe, and this is an area in which Marvel succeeded, was its lack of diversity. Marvel is very diverse with having black characters, Latino characters from the very beginning. DC, not so much. And the characters they did have were almost like these really cringeworthy stereotypes. Like Green Lantern had a best friend called Pie Face, who was supposed to be a native Hawaiian. So
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It's pretty bad.
Well, they've updated since, though, because they have, what was it, John Stewart as Green Lantern now, right?
Right. So that happened in the 70s. So they were
Okay.
trying to diversify, but it was still a mostly white cast of primary characters. In the 90s, they started replacing all these legacy characters with newer versions. So the Atom Died was replaced with an Asian Atom. They had, black and female and gay and disabled versions of all the different characters. But a lot of fans took umbrage to this, not because of the race, the diversity, but because of the way in which the storyline was handled.
You're changing
Yeah.
key elements to these characters.
It wasn't even so much what they did, it was how they did it. It was sort of these hackneyed storylines where someone suddenly got killed off in an explosion, like, oh, look, and now there's a black so-and-so.
Yeah.
Um,
It's not justified.
right. So Jeff Johns wrote a series of stories called Rebirths, where basically he brought back the original iconic versions of the Flash and Green Lantern. Green Lantern returned to being Hal Jordan. The Flash returned to being Barry Allen. He is unabashedly nostalgic for the 60s and early 70s versions of the characters. Admittedly, almost all of whom are white. Jeff Johns was controversial because basically he returned the DC universe to what many believe was a status quo of mainly white characters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see him getting a lot of hate for that nowadays.
Right. And I don't think it was done intentionally. It was
is.
No, I definitely don't think it was racially motivated at all. I think he was just genuinely ignorant about why certain people would want to see more diversity in these characters that they grew up with. As an example, there's an event called Flashpoint, and in the Flash comic book series, there is a place called Gorilla City, which is populated by a group of extremely intelligent gorillas. Who are telepathic. No, the leader is telepathic. I'm sorry. In this Flashpoint series, which took place in a dark future, Gorilla City ended up taking over the entirety of Africa, and he referred to Africa as Gorilla Island.
Oh, wow.
And until he had this storm of hate mail, did not understand why that was very offensive. So Jeff Johns is one of those guys who is... I think he's very well-intentioned, good-natured, and he is a very good, competent writer, but maybe not necessarily the best choice to sort of provide stewardship of this brand-new film franchise into the 21st century.
Okay. That's some good background.
Thanks.
Wow. All right, so what do you think oh, man, this is going to be hard. I don't know how to segue into this, but let's go into the movie. So the first movie that came out, Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. Mixed reactions.
Yeah.
Some people loved it because it, like you said, it kind of brought things into the 21st century. It was like a newer style of Superman. And then a lot of these hardcore fans were like, this is too dark for Superman. Like, you Zack Snyder'd Superman.
Right.
You toned down his costume. He's more muted colors. He's not as like the Boy Scout anymore. He
kills someone in the end.
He murders General Zod at the end of the movie.
Right, and it's for a completely illogical reason,
Yeah, because he can't turn his head in the opposite direction.
Just turn his head.
Yeah. There's some valid criticism to that
And there's
movie.
a massive death toll.
Oh, huge. Yeah, the entire city blew up. It was like a crater at the end.
It was awful. Yeah, after the first couple buildings, you're like, oh, okay, well, it's Superman.
They really went over... And I think, if I remember correctly, I remember hearing Zack Snyder say why he did that. He was trying to bring these Kryptonian godlike characters down into our world, and like, what would happen if these two were to get into a fight?
Right.
Like, that's, and even in the animated series that I grew up with in the 90s, Superman would fight in the city all the time. He would poke holes through buildings all the time. Things would fall down. That kind of thing didn't really bother me. The world-ending machine that was basically turning the city into a crater, that was a bit much. But the buildings falling, I was kind of okay with that part. They went, like I said, they went overboard when they just cratered the whole place. But that was one of the core value of the character, which is he's Superman. He's supposed to be better than all of us. That's the whole point of his character.
Yeah.
Is for us to look up to him. and here he is in a quote unquote no-win situation, and he has to kill the guy. Like, that's
Right.
immediately undermines his whole character, and then we're supposed to trust him after that. It's like it's a bit of a problem story-wise. Zack Snyder, he took a risk, and he did the same thing with Batman. He did the same exact thing with Batman, but we'll talk about that in a second. We'll get into Batman.
Yeah.
So some of the missteps, I feel, Zack Snyder, I think if somebody was able to rein him in a little bit, I think Zack Snyder would have been just fine as being the main director of these movies. Maybe not both Batman and Superman, but at least let him finish off a Superman trilogy and just kind of hold the reins a little bit on him and make sure it doesn't go overboard. But I think the biggest misstep is rushing the story.
Oh, yeah.
So like we were just talking about, you have 75 years of comic books to feed off of, to write these stories for the new 21st century cinematic universe, and they went straight from introducing Superman to now Batman's 50 years old and he wants to kill Superman. Like that, heavily influenced by the Dark Knight comic book. Almost page for page, you have Batman in his suit, he has the same motivation, he wants to kill Superman. But the Dark Knight comic book predicated on their relationship having been decades old. Like, they've known each other for a really long time, and they've moved in different directions, and Superman is now a different person. He's working for the government, basically, and he has been ordered to stop Batman because Batman's become an over-violent vigilante. He's a liability, and he can't be allowed to continue. So there's your conflict, but they did 2 movies, and they did all that, crunched all that storyline down into one movie where you have Batman, his reason for wanting to kill Superman, and then at the end of the movie they're buddies and they're fighting and they're going to start the Justice League. It was just a bad idea. Like, I know this is we're gonna just say it. Whatever. They should have did what Marvel did. They should have just did
Why can't you be like your brother?
I know people are going to smash their heads into the wall when I say this, but they should have at least copied something of what Marvel was doing and given these characters a little bit of time to breathe.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. You could have had a much, much better flushed out universe with these characters if they all had at least 1 or 2 standalone films to kind of introduce them, give their motivations, and then continue on.
Absolutely right. Superman was the biggest, misstep. They, like you said, he's this messianic character.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to see a perfect portrayal of Superman, you can read Grant Morrison's comic book miniseries called All-Star Superman, where he really gets into the nature of the character, who's like this, he's like this helpful god on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Towards the end of the series, there's a scene where Lex Luthor very briefly gets his powers, and he's suddenly able to see how everything in the universe interacts, all the particles, all the energies. And he starts crying because he says this is how he sees the world every day. He's an aspirational character. And they went for style over substance here. Zack Snyder, I think everybody would agree, visually an amazing director.
Yeah.
He really has an eye for cinematography. But not so much for everything that comes, with the visuals that gives it its real punch.
Yeah.
And I think it's a beautiful film in a lot of ways. You can freeze a lot of moments of it and hang it on your wall. But as far as the actual execution of it, it's not really Superman. It sounds like something I would have come up with when I was 16 and trying to be edgy. And, it eschewed a lot of what makes Superman so such a connecting figure for a lot of people.
Right.
Not just Americans, but really all over the world. I think it was the darkness works really well for the Batman movies, so let's make all the movies dark.
Yeah.
It really ignored the process, again, like Marvel did, of finding out what makes each character tick and then building, a film around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the good things that you liked besides the cinematography? Was there anything that you enjoyed about Man of Steel and or Batman versus Superman? Personally, I liked seeing Ben Affleck as Batman, this gruff Dark Knight Returns style. I think they they pushed it a little bit too far, like I said before, with the timing of having these two characters vastly different
They
ages.
should have met in the middle of the movie.
Something. But anyway, Ben Affleck did a great job of portraying The Dark Knight Returns. I mean, he's perfect. He's built like a brick house. He's huge in this movie. He's got that same gruff look. I liked his motivation as far as you've got this older Batman. He's seen the worst that humanity can give. He's lost a lot of people. He mentioned it in the movie a couple times and they have the Robin outfit with the bullet holes and the Joker ha 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 written over it. Like, he's lost a lot. And I got into not an argument, but a little bit of a debate with some people on Twitter about if that was a good portrayal of Batman. And some were like, no, Batman's, he's dark and he's angry, but he's never crossed that line. And they shouldn't have done that. And I'm like, then my argument is, okay, but that's not the Batman that we're seeing. We're seeing Batman 20 years after that. We're seeing him aged and just filled with hate and filled with anger and done. He's done with trying to save these criminals. You're not going to save criminals. They're already what they are, and you either have to just end them or they're just going to go right back to keep doing what they're doing. He's tired of locking people up and watching them get out and go back and doing the same thing over and over again. So there is that argument where Batman can I don't want to say justifiably kill, but his character can justifiably kill somebody because he's been through it, and he's like, this is pointless. I'm not going to save this person's life for no reason. You forfeited your ability to want to be alive because you're coming after me. You're doing doing bad things in the world, so I'm done with you. So that's kind of the motivation. I can kind of see where Zack Snyder was trying to go, and then when he sees this godlike figure destroy a city, which he did, he destroyed the entire city, Batman's like, I'm the only one that I know of who can stop this person, so I have to do it, because otherwise this could happen again and thousands of people could die. I kind of get it. I think it was probably a wrong step, but if in isolation, Batman versus Superman, Batman's motivation for wanting to kill Superman, it works. Not for a whole franchise, but in one single movie, it works. So I like that element of the character, but I don't know if I'm in the minority or not. I don't really hear a lot of people say that. So
no, I understand where you're coming from. I think again, it's a writing thing. You could have written the story in a way where you understood how he arrives to that point in his psychology. This one time I have to break my rule because if I don't, everyone else is going to die.
Yeah.
And that does, I guess you could argue, follow along with the psychology of Batman, that he has to be the one that's damned in order to save everybody else.
Right.
I have to throw my life, my body, my mind into the fire, devote myself as a soldier to fighting, the darkness of humanity, so that other people don't have to suffer like I did as a boy.
Yeah, he's putting himself in front of them. That makes sense.
But that's not really apparent,
Yeah.
And again, like you mentioned before, I think it's true. They did try to model him after the Dark Knight Returns portrayal of Batman. But there's a lot that Frank Miller put into that book that is not in the movie that's important. I mean, one of the reasons he comes to heads with Superman is because at that point, the Reagan administration has created this homogenous, pseudo-religious political environment in which they dominate the entire world, and there's almost like a cult-like following of the party. And Frank Miller reveals in the sequel that they were holding the city of Kandor hostage, and that was why he did all those things. But it's supposed to be emblematic of this opposition to nationalism,
Okay.
Batman in a way is almost treated like a terrorist in his own country, because he represents this individual libertarianism that is not supposed to exist in this, perfect America that Reagan had envisioned. But, again, like, in order to have this, to have this duality between the two characters apparent, you need to build up the world that they live in first, and they never bothered doing that. Even the fact that the movie is called Batman versus Superman just tells you a lot about their motivations.
Yeah.
We
want these two characters to fight.
We want them to fight, so we can make money, because everyone's wanted to see them fight since they were 12 years old with their action figure. So let's just give it to people, right?
Yeah. What's the line from Jurassic Park with Ian Malcolm where he's like, your scientists never thought that they never gave a thought that they should, or they just slapped it on a plastic lunchbox and now they're selling it. They're going to sell it. So that's the same mentality that DC kind of has.
Exactly.
Like, you don't really think about whether you should. Just do it and sell it and get the money out
it's
there.
like, we're going to make a lot of money. You guys just figure out how to make this kind of appealing,
Yeah. Now, and that gives another, like you were talking about the story, one of the other things that I kind of felt was the death of Superman in that movie was wasted.
Oh, yeah.
The death of Superman with him fighting Doomsday, I feel personally that should have been Henry Cavill's third movie. That should have been the end of his Superman trilogy.
Absolutely.
Have his first movie in Man of Steel. Second movie, oh God, bring Brainiac. Please, somebody get Brainiac.
Right.
That would be a perfect villain. Have him versus Brainiac. Maybe Lex Luthor and Brainiac work together, and then that's the second movie. Third movie is Doomsday and Superman dies. Mm-hmm. Then that's like a perfect trilogy for Henry Cavill to have under his belt. But instead, they kill him off in not even his own sequel. It's just like a mashup. It's not anybody's particular movie.
And you don't, as an audience, really care about Superman enough to be affected by his death. Like you said, it should have been drawn out. Have the villain that kills him be introduced subtly in the first movie.
Yeah, maybe even
like
that.
Thanos. And and you lead up to the point where you have so much invested in Superman, and you relate, or you look up to him so much. You're inspired so much by this character that when the final fight comes, you're like, yes, I can't wait to see him stop this villain, and then he loses.
Yeah.
He dies. You're like, oh my God, you didn't expect that. And neither did the rest of the world. And so now it's picking up the pieces. What happens when your Messiah is killed? What do you do after that?
Yeah.
That would have made Justice League and all that a lot more compelling.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I was thinking about stepping back a little bit to Marvel. One of the criticisms of Marvel is that they don't have any stakes because nobody ever dies. That's an opportunity for DC to come in and show them what they can do. Like, look, these have stakes. People die. Like, yes, eventually Superman comes back, but maybe leave it for 3-4 films. Have 3 or 4 more films. Superman's gone.
Right.
And then eventually bring him back. That kind of gives it more stakes. You can actually have characters that will die. And
it's a moment that makes you jump out of your seat. Oh my God! It's
yeah. That could have been. There's so many opportunities that DC has to be better than Marvel, and they just miss it almost every single time. The only thing I can say that they're really good at is casting. Like, they cast everybody
fantastic
casting. The only one that I was talking to you about that's kind of controversial is Ezra Miller as Barry Allen.
Yeah.
Some people don't like the portrayal. They think he's a little bit too goofy, too jokey, which, I mean, it's fair, whatever, but I think he did okay.
That's fine.
He did fine. I'm not attached to Barry Allen in any way, so I'm not really the one that should be talking about it, but it is what it is. And then so let's talk about Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. Her first movie, it's probably the shining light in the DC universe right now. It's the one thing that everybody can point to and say, that is what DC can do. I didn't like it that much. I liked it. I thought Gal Gadot really stepped up her game as far as acting. I think the only thing that she was ever in was Fast and the Furious as eye candy, as some, whatever, just a side character. And then they took on this role, and a lot of people were like, "Are you kidding me? Gal Gadot? Who is she? She's nobody. Why is she
a model?
Why is she given Wonder Woman? Like, this is a big character." She walked right in there and owned the character, and I think she did a great job. The only thing I didn't like about her movie was the third act. I felt like the ending battle with her and Ares was a little bit cartoonish, like video game boss battle.
Yeah.
I didn't really feel it had a lot of stakes, but it's hard to say what could have been better, what they would have done. I'm not really sure differently to make it more enjoyable. But the movie itself, her as the character, I think was really well done. Who was the director that did it? It was I can't remember her name, but it was a great directing by the lady who did the directing. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
That, I think, of all the things that they need to hold on to, it's going to be her.
Yeah.
Going forward.
Her portrayal was excellent. The progression from like this naive girl to how she gets weathered by seeing war and actual violence before. Because before on the island, they imply you're trained to be a soldier, but you're just play acting.
Yeah. You don't ever see death.
You're preparing for something that will probably never come. Mm-hmm. And then she sees death around her, and for something, which is intangible. Patty Jenkins. There you go. Patty Jenkins.
Patty Jenkins directed Wonder Woman.
But I mean, yeah, I thought it was handled. I didn't think it was, like the most amazing movie. I think the third part, like you said, the third act really watered it down a lot. But even so, I mean, comparatively to the other DC movies, it was miles ahead of what they had demonstrated so far.
And let's just compare Captain Marvel, or Captain Marvel, that's coming up pretty soon, Captain America to Wonder Woman. They both in that, it's a different world war, but they're both in that war. That's kind of their origin story, where they go into war and they become who they are after the war ends. They had so much more action and better sequences for her fighting. That the No Man's Land sequence where she goes out and she's got her shield and she's taking on the bullets, like, those are epic shots as compared to what they did with Captain America. Is they just had like a montage of him jumping around, doing it was okay, but you compare it to that and it's night and day.
Yeah.
And you put Wonder Woman on the front lines of World War One, and it just it was amazing. That was like the best sequence of that whole film.
Yeah.
And it's just one example of what DC can do differently. Maybe Marvel does really good work, but then DC can step it up and do better, or something like that. It's just examples of how they can match Marvel or overcome Marvel with their cinematic universe, and they just keep failing. So, Suicide Squad. Oh, this movie was bad. This was another example. I think it's a recurring theme now that I think about it, but Marvel or DC, it's always about, what did you want to see when you were 12 years old?
Right.
And let's put it on screen and just not worry about it. Like that's exactly what Suicide Squad was. Yeah. It was a teenager's dream. Oh, let's have cool music. Let's have flashy characters with these crazy designs and these crazy costumes. And then let's just have them go and take on an endless supply of no-faced baddies and just go, shoot everything, whatever. And then we'll blow it up at the end. We'll have some weird ghost witch lady kind of dance around for a while. It was again the wasted potential. You had all the Rogues Gallery. Batman's Rogues Gallery is one of the best villains ever of any comic book universe. Batman has the best villains, and they wasted them.
Yeah, their over-sexualization of Harley Quinn was a bizarre choice. Just from a storytelling standpoint, I understand why they did it. They wanted to get butts in the seat,
Yeah, and her character is the only one I can think of that hasn't been over-sexualized would be the Batman animated series with Mark Hamill as the Joker and then Harley Quinn.
Right.
That was the only time I saw her where she didn't have short shorts and whatever. You look at her in the Arkham video games. Mm-hmm. She's always in some crazy slutty outfit. Yeah. It's kind of as per usual, unfortunately. I think they could probably do better with the character. Margot Robbie did fine. I wouldn't mind seeing her again as that character, but they definitely have to tone that like craziness down a little bit.
Yeah, I thought the scenes, I personally, maybe some people will disagree with this, thought the scenes between her and the Joker were the most evocative of the movie. Because and again, they rushed through it, but the psychological dependency that she has on this extremely abusive person was something interesting to be explored. Also, we got the rich Cholo version of the Joker.
Yeah, I mean, Jared Leto is one heck of an actor, but that version of the Joker did not appeal to me at all. I was watching and I'm like, this is just weird.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
I thought it was interesting, but again, it's more style than substance. You know?
With the tattoos, like one of the, I can't remember who it was. It was somebody on YouTube, whether it was Collider Video or one of those, they were talking about the Joker and they're like, who sits down? What version of the Joker? You think of the Joker's personality. What version of that character do you see sitting in a tattoo parlor for 8-10 hours getting ha 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 written perfectly? It's not like messy. It's not like somebody took a tattoo pen and messed it up. It's like an actual perfect situated tattoo. Like, I don't see any version of the Joker being able to sit still that long.
Yeah. Well, I do know that director in particular has this like East LA aesthetic he tries to thread through his movies. And so I guess the Joker he viewed as a natural imprint for it. But you're right. The rest of that movie was also, again, very much like a video game. It was like playing like one of those side scrollers from the early 90s where you're beating up random people.
Yeah, there's just the wave of the army of bad guys that have no face. They all look exactly the same. You get through them and then you fight the final boss battle. Yeah.
Again, an interesting concept that was not executed well.
Yeah. I think, I remember the actress that played. What's the girl's name? The witch.
Cara Delevingne.
And her character was
the Enchantress.
Enchantress.
Yeah,
that's a cool character, and I love the visuals that they had for her. The way she like morphed into her.
Yeah,
with
those
the hand
when
the hand came up around her and it flipped over. Do you remember that scene?
Yeah, very creepy.
Very creepy. Yeah. Like the execution of that was perfect. But then they had her for the majority of the movie. They had her just dancing.
Right.
Like she was doing this like weird hula hoop thing, and they just had her standing there and talking.
Now I'm a giant fire beast.
Yeah, I was like, I mean, it just continued to be like, what are you doing? Like you have all these things that you could. We're bashing on DC too much. Justice League. Here we go. So this is the real one. This is kind of a sad story because what happened to Zack Snyder? He lost his daughter, and he had to. Yeah, you didn't know that?
Oh my god.
Yeah. In the middle, I think it was in the middle of filming. His daughter died. I don't, you can look up how. I don't want to talk too much about it, but his daughter ended up dying, and he had to take off, and he left production of the film. And Joss Whedon came in. Interesting choice to take over a Zack Snyder movie. They're like polar opposites. You got Joss Whedon, who's known for, like we were talking about earlier, his lighthearted comedy and his ensemble film, fun, haha. And then Zack Snyder, who has continually been dark throughout this whole DCEU. You said you watched it, but you didn't finish it?
Yeah, that's a sad thing. Like, I think we've established thus far that I've been a heavy, heavy comic book reader. Not just superhero comics, but comics of all genres since I was a kid. And this is like the one movie I should have been looking forward to my entire life. And, partway, just like, this is not worth, I could be doing my dishes right now. Doing my dishes was more important to me.
Oh my God. That's so bad. Yeah, it's a sad thing. I don't know. I watched it 3 times. I saw it once in theaters. And then it came out on HBO a couple months ago, and I watched it twice on HBO. Because I wanted to give it a shot. I'm like, okay, am I missing something? Is there some redeeming quality to this film? And
it seems like a pattern, right? Every DC movie, maybe I'm just missing something.
Yeah, that's kind of what Star Wars apologists say too. Like, you just have to go watch it 6 times and make up reasons why it works.
It's like Dungeons and Dragons. You have to play it for 4 months, and then you'll start having fun.
So there was, I think, one of my biggest criticisms, and this is some of the reasons why some of my friends don't even like Superman, because he's so overpowered. You had Aquaman, Cyborg, and Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman herself should be able to hold her own against Superman. They had all 3 of those characters dogpiled on top of Henry Cavill at one point. Did you watch that scene?
No.
Okay, they resurrect him.
Okay.
With the magic box that they stole from Wolfenstein. And he comes back to life, but he doesn't really remember who he is. He's kind of like got amnesia. Okay. But he's just standing there. It's like a big set piece where they got Superman standing on one end of the screen, and then they have the quote-unquote Justice League standing on the other side. And because he doesn't know who they are, he gets a little suspicious, and then Cyborg has like this red alert feature on his armor, and it shoots at Superman without him wanting it to, as like just trying to protect itself from some kind of a threat. I don't really understand it either.
Plot device.
Yeah. So Superman then attacks the Justice League.
Okay.
So you have Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and Cyborg all trying to stop Superman. And they all, like I said, dogpile on top of him, and Henry Cavill doesn't even budge. There's no effort at all for him to stand there and take all 3 of them. He's holding Wonder Woman up, he's holding Aquaman back, and Cyborg is like trying to push him, but he's not even moving. It's the weirdest, like you're watching it and you're like, that's too much. Like you can't have one character have that much power, because then what's the point of the rest of them even being there? Mm-hmm. So it kind of dilutes the rest of the characters. Oh, and he's faster than the Flash too. So the Flash comes running up, and he's in the Speed Force mode, and he's running in like super slow motion, and it's one of the better scenes of the movie because it kind of makes you laugh. But Ezra Miller's running, and he looks over at Superman, and Superman, you see his eyes move. And then that's when Ezra Miller, as the Flash, realizes that he can move at the same speed as him. Mm. And then Superman drops the rest of the Justice League, and he runs after the Flash, and they get into a little scuffle. But he basically overpowers all 4 of them at the same time. Then there's this really, really bad scene where Henry Cavill as Superman is fighting Wonder Woman one-on-one. And instead of having like this cool epic like fist fight where they're kind of boxing each other, or at least, doing some kind of fighting, they decide to have them headbutt each other multiple times.
I'm sorry.
So Henry Cavill or Wonder Woman gets grabbed. Superman's got her by the cuff.
Okay.
She can't get away, so she headbutts him. He takes a hit. He looks at her, headbutts her back, and then stands up and headbutts her again and drives her into the concrete. That's the fight. That's all they do. Is like a 3-minute little sequence of them fighting, and all they do is headbutt each other.
See, that's strange too, because okay, I just thought of something. Another difference between Marvel and DC films that Marvel gets right is the physics of fighting. Right? People, I mean, they're superheroes, but they are moving and falling and dropping somewhat realistically. He headbutts her and it drops her to the ground instead of like exploding through the back of her head.
Yeah, she goes to the ground and then she makes a crater in the concrete.
And she makes a crater in the concrete.
Yeah.
Somehow. Okay.
I wish it was still on HBO. I'd turn it on the TV so you could watch it, but it is that bad. Yeah, she makes a crater in the concrete. So it's really weird, the decisions they made on those movies, but we'll move on. Okay. So did we talk about great casting, Wonder Woman, hugely popular characters? We talked about all that. Okay, so moving on. Everybody, even if you're a DC fan, everybody knows that the DC has made some serious mistakes. Yeah. And they have to kind of change direction. They have to course correct. So moving forward, the next thing that we have, the newest news that we had was Superman. Henry Cavill is on the rocks about playing Superman anymore. Yeah. So they've already lost Ben Affleck. He's done playing the character. Yeah. He's moved on. Henry Cavill's on the rocks. They wanted him. Did you hear this news yet?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, they wanted him to do a cameo in Shazam, but he refused. I think basically it's because of the contract where once a character is in 4 movies, then they get like a huge pay raise, and I think they're arguing about that. So technically this would be him in his 4th movie that he probably is asking for more money. Rightfully so. He's one of the best Supermans we've ever seen.
Oh yeah, he's perfect.
He looks exactly like him. He's perfect for the role, so rightfully so. He's probably asking for more money, and he doesn't want to do a cameo. He wants his own movie. I wouldn't blame him. I haven't even had my own sequel yet, and we're like 9 films in, right? So I get where he's coming from, but that's to be determined. We'll see what happens with that. The next thing that we have is Joaquin Phoenix, in my personal opinion, knocking it out of the park with his Joker. Yeah, it's every time I see like a little promo or a little behind the scenes or something leaked, I'm looking at it, I'm like, this looks awesome. And there's a couple of reasons why. One of the biggest reasons is the budget. They're only giving him $50 million to make this movie. Super low budget.
It's a good idea.
$50 million is nothing. Low risk for the studio, and it forces the creative team to not rely on, like you were talking about, with spectacle. Oh, let's just make everything blow up. We'll just do this. It'll distract people from kind of the wishy-washy story. No, this is going to be camera, actor, and that's it. We have real sets. We have real everything. We're putting people on the set and we're filming them, and that's about it, and that's all we're going to get. And then you got Joaquin Phoenix, who's one of the best actors acting right now.
Well, the backup cast too, that Robert De Niro, Mark Maron. I'm really interested to see how they integrate them into the film. I'm glad they're moving in this direction. I'd rather see DC take a break from the big budget things and focus on these smaller character pieces.
Yeah. So we have a couple more big budget ones coming. We have Aquaman, which I like Jason Momoa, but to be honest, he's coming off as just like this no-brained surfer dude in all his movies. I hope it's better. I'm hoping it's really good, but it looks like it's just going to be a bunch of spectacle. CGI. They have people riding sharks. They have seahorses that are bigger than people. It's
like the 60s Aquaman.
Yeah, it's a crazy. The trailer was like overwhelming. I was watching. I'm like, it's cool, but I just feel like it's going to be kind of too much. Like it's going to be too much going on the screen, and they're not going to focus on the story.
Yeah.
And then we have Wonder Woman 84, which I have high hopes for. I don't really know much about the story. I know that she's going to be fighting Cheetah, which I don't really know anything about that villain. The casting is interesting on this one because Cheetah, they casted the girl from SNL.
Kristen Wiig, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a real. I don't know if I'm going to be able to separate her from. You know how when you see somebody who's super famous on screen, you're like, you can't separate the character that they're playing from who they are. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm going to watch this and be like, why isn't she making a joke? Like, that's what I know her from. She's an SNL character. You know, she's always cracking jokes. She's always in funny comedy movies, and now she's going to be playing a DC villain.
Well, that was Michael Keaton's stigma too when he took on Batman.
Yeah.
Right.
I
He was
guess.
mostly a comedic actor, and
I
I'll
hope
give her a shot.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Maybe this one will be the one.
Maybe. Patty Jenkins is directing Wonder Woman 1984, so yeah, she's back on. So I have faith it's going to be pretty decent. And then we have what else? Oh, Shazam with Zachary Levi. Mm-hmm. This is a far cry from the Zack Snyder dark grit. This is going to be a 14-year-old with superpowers. Right. It's going to be funny. It's going to be more new age comedy, I think, with aiming towards a younger audience. Jokes that teenagers would make nowadays that I probably don't get are going to be in this movie. Mm-hmm. But Zachary Levi, I had some trepidations about this at the beginning. I made it known in one of my very, very early podcasts where he looked like he was in a big puffed up suit. It didn't look like... I know Zachary Levi from his show Chuck, where he's like this super skinny, nerdy guy. He's never, ever, in my wildest dreams, have ever come off as some buff, jacked dude. So when I saw the set photos of him in the Shazam outfit, and he was wearing this big, and he looked jacked, and I'm like, that's fake. He's wearing a puffy suit. Like, it immediately had my mind going, oh crap, what's DC doing now? But then I've kind of reined it back a little bit on that, because I've seen some photos of him on his Instagram. He's actually he got big for this role. I'm proud of him for doing it. That's a good thing.
I think it's Captain Marvel too. It's supposed to be goofy and cartoonish, and the comic itself was aimed more at like a much
Captain
younger
Marvel.
audience.
You mean DC Captain Marvel? Shazam.
I'm sorry, Shazam.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore.
That's right. Yeah,
Captain Marvel DC is no longer Captain Marvel.
If the audience doesn't know, the original name of the character is Captain Marvel. Shazam is the word that he speaks out loud to turn from boy into man, so to speak. But because of a lawsuit from Marvel Comics, he could not call himself Captain Marvel on the comic book itself or any associated media. He has to go by Shazam.
Yeah. So from now on, he is Shazam.
He is Shazam.
And that's the end of that. I have high hopes for that movie. I think it'll be a lot of fun to watch. It'll be a nice palate cleanser from the other DC movies.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about DC? Where do you think they're going in the future? Do you think they're going to be putting a new Superman out there?
Well, they're in a pickle right now because they're probably going to lose their two primary actors. They're going to be put in a situation where no one's going to want to work with them. You know, I wouldn't call them box office poison because people are going to go see it, but it can seriously affect people's careers. I mean, that's probably why Henry Cavill's walking away. You know?
Yeah, he's doing. He signed on to the Witcher franchise now with Netflix, and that's I'm assuming is going to be multiple seasons. So that's going to take up a lot of his time. I don't think he's going to have time to be held on by DC. So
no, and you can look at it from a creative standpoint too. I mean, ultimately, people want to do stuff that's fulfilling to them. You know, you got to take what's available. But these actors and screenwriters, directors are at a point in their career where they don't have to do these films.
Yeah,
and
Cavill's like, you know what? I could go play James Bond.
He could.
He could.
He
Did you see Man from U.N.C.L.E.?
No.
With him and Armie Hammer, I think his name is.
No.
Dude, that is such a good movie.
Is it?
I love that movie.
Okay.
It's like the perfect mix of comedy and spy action.
Okay.
So it's not Mission Impossible, because Mission Impossible has gotten a little serious. Not lately. They've always been kind of serious. But campy James Bond and...
like Tom Cruise's Coma Dream.
Yeah. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., I think, was one of my favorite movies that I was watching a while ago. I was like, this movie's so good. Henry Cavill's perfect. His comedic timing in that movie is perfect. Like, he did really good. So I think if he wanted to, after this James Bond 25 comes out, if he kind of wanted to campaign for being James Bond, I think there would be a lot of people in favor of that. Yeah. So as sad as it is to say, I think he might be done with Superman. And I don't really blame him for it. I think he's done all he can in the role. And I think DC needs to move on. And I wanted to mention before I forget, what I think DC should do is what we were kind of mentioning a little bit, is do these like singular movies that aren't necessarily connected. Yeah. Like just, I honestly, I'm probably in the minority in this, but have you seen Alex Ross artwork for Batman and Superman? It's got that ultra realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that artwork, and I want to see period pieces. I want to see Batman in the 1930s with like the gangster mafia villains, and I want to see a guy who have it be Batman, but have him in like just a cloth suit and just be a really like a big barrel-chested dude who wants to fight crime, and he has his obviously his normal Batman reasons for doing so. The mafia killed his parents or whatever. I want to see that in a period piece in the 1930s, and I want to see Superman post World War II in the 40s. I know it's crazy, and I don't think it would be bankable for DC to do as far as like putting it out in the cinemas, but I've always thought that those two characters, especially because of where they were created, I think they fit best in those timelines.
Absolutely. I think that I agree with you. You know, there's this branch of I don't know if it's I think that's not the right term, but DC Comics has like these one-off storylines they call Elseworlds, where they take their main characters and then they put them in these different situations. So they had, for example, one called Gotham by Gaslight, and that's Batman trying to hunt down Jack the Ripper in the 1800s.
Yeah.
They had one called Red Sun, where what if Superman, his rocket landed in the Soviet Union instead of the United States? I'd love to see standalone pieces like that, you know, because we're familiar enough with these characters. All of these movies are predicated on the idea that maybe no one knows who these people are, and we need to reintroduce them to Superman. Yeah. That's not an issue. I think that you can make these very interesting character pieces, like you said, that are not connected to anything else, and get a better product out of it. I'd love to see a Superman movie set in the 1930s with the whole Art Deco theme. You know, the post-war paranoia. You have, you know, as he was originally intended, you know, almost like these socialist undertones, and you know, there's a lot of really rich storytelling potential that you could go from, you know, with either one of those.
And it would also tone down the your suspension of disbelief with these films a lot too, because now with Batman in the 21st century, you got like, he has to wear armor. Right. Like he has to. You can't have a Batman that doesn't have like this crazy suited armor. Like you put him back in the 30s and you can tone that down a little bit where he's not necessarily in a armored suit, but maybe he has something, because he's obviously going to be fighting people. There was guns back there, but it's vastly different. You can do a completely different aesthetic, and I want to see that. We've seen Nolan's Batman in the 21st century, and I think that worked perfectly. But I think moving forward, DC's best option might be to do these little standalone movies. They got the Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, hire a solid cast and a low budget for a Batman movie, and have it a period piece with the Mafia, and like we were talking about, you can even do, like, name it Elseworld or whatever they want to name it to signify that it's different, and have Superman be a bad guy. Well, you know, why not have him be raised in the Soviet Union? Like, that would be amazing. It'd be so much fun to watch. It might not make a ton of money like they're thinking they want to make, but if you target the audience, the fan base that they have already, and I think they'll make, and keep the budgets low. You're not talking about $250 million. Just do $100 million or $80 million budget. I think you could still make your money back and have some really, really good products out there. That's just me. I'm sure
I agree with
the
you.
executives in Hollywood are probably like, "You're crazy. We'll never make any money doing that." Okay, so let's wrap up. We'll do full circle. We'll talk about the Dark Universe, which is Universal Studios' attempt to recreate their own cinematic universe in kind of the same vein as Marvel. They tripped on the first step, and I'm not really sure why. I can't nail. Did you see The Mummy with Tom Cruise? I saw it. Mm. It was okay. It's hard to nail down what went wrong. I'd have to watch a couple of videos on YouTube or something to jog my memory of what I was watching. But it just didn't work quite as well as they had hoped, and it kind of they made the same mistake that DC made, is they announced that they were making a cinematic universe before they even did anything. So like, we have 9 films on the way out right now. We're going to start with this one, and then this one bombed, and they were like, okay, well, maybe we should wait. And they were like, okay, I guess
You
we
got
need
to get that first one right.
Yeah, you have to get a good first step, or don't announce a cinematic universe. Just put out a movie and see how it does.
Right.
And maybe put out 2 or 3 movies and see how they do, and then you can announce that this is officially a cinematic universe. I did like one of the things in The Mummy with Tom Cruise was they had a Easter egg for a far superior mummy movie with Brendan Fraser. They had the Book of the Dead, the gold book that he had in Brendan Fraser's movie.
Yeah.
They had a cameo of that in this new movie, and I was like, oh, that's the book from the other movie. I was such a nerd. I love the Brendan Fraser mummy movie. It's so much fun. It's like kind of a campy, comedic adventure movie.
Yeah.
Almost like an Indiana Jones type, and that really worked for that movie, and I loved it. And this new one, I think they may have gone a little too dark, but they had all this set up. They have we'll talk about the people that they have hired. They have some top A list actors. Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man. They announced him being attached to this project before. Yeah, that's great casting. He'd be really good. Get him away from Tim Burton for a while. I'm so sick and tired of seeing Johnny Depp in Tim Burton movies. Like, get over it, dude. Javier Bardem as Frankenstein.
That's really
That's perfect. No Country for Old Men. He basically was Frankenstein. I mean, that's perfect.
Yeah, that's a really interesting casting.
And then Bride of Frankenstein. They were asking Angelina Jolie. I don't know if she officially signed on or if she said yes or no or whatever, but that's what they wanted to do, which I think would probably work. She's a great actress. I think she would fit the role well. She has that bone structure that she could pull off that makeup set. You remember the old Bride of Frankenstein with the big hair with the white? Mm-hmm. She got like that kind of real thin frame. I think Angelina Jolie would fit perfectly with that. Did you see Dracula Untold?
No.
Okay, so there was a movie. It was a while ago now. I want to say like 2014, maybe 15. I could be completely wrong. I have no idea. But it was a Dracula movie, and it was basically his origin movie. And I think they may have actually tried to start this dark universe thing way back then, because they set it up where they told Dracula's origin movie where it's actually kind of lines up a little bit with the actual real world Dracula. He's an actual he's an actual figure in history that he's known for being really, really brutal to his enemies.
Vlad the Impaler.
Yes, exactly. Vlad the Impaler. And it was his story about how he became that villain, but he wasn't the villain in the movie. He was actually the good guy, and he was just doing it just to defend his family and his own city. He was trying to defend it against a far superior army. And he went and he got the powers of Dracula from the devil, basically. It was another Dracula, but I can't remember if they played it off as if it was actually the devil or if it was just another vampire. I can't remember. But it was played by who's the guy who plays Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones? Super famous actor. What's his name? I can't remember. Anyway, besides the point. They end the movie with him being immortal and surviving into the 21st century. And they kind of leave it at that. And that kind of sets up with this overall dark universe theme where they want to have it in the 21st century. So then they have Tom Cruise. They have all these cameos with, they had Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Awesome. Russell Crowe, you can't go wrong with Russell Crowe. Definitely good casting on that part. So they have all these pieces in ready to go, but they kind of just stumbled on this first step. There was a Instagram post from some director that said that they were working on Dark Universe material again. So I think they might be moving forward with it now, but it just goes
cautiously, I hope.
Yeah, cautiously. And I hope they take their time and they learn from DC's mistakes and they take their time and worry less about spectacle and more about good storytelling. Yeah. And that's what people want. I mean, you can make a movie look gorgeous, but if it's a horrible story, it's not going to be remembered.
Who cares?
You might make an opening box office hit, but nobody's going to care after that. And
what is it? The movie Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, right? It was the most expensive movie ever made at that point.
Oh,
magnificent sets and costume design.
Yeah.
One of the biggest flops in history because the storyline was awful. I think they buried part of the set under the sand somewhere in the California desert.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
I don't know why Hollywood it seems like they keep making the same mistakes over and over again, huh?
They do. I mean, remember, at the end of the day, it's a business,
Yeah.
So they're trying to make money, and they're going to do whatever makes money with as low risk as possible. I think, the reason why they've latched onto superhero films is because since the 80s, which was sort of the end of the auteur era of filmmaking and the beginning of the franchise era, Hollywood has been looking for some kind of intellectual property that they can just recycle over and over again. We saw it with in the 80s, they had the remakes of the old horror movies from the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
In the 90s, they were trying to remake old TV shows, into
They're
movies.
still doing that now.
They're still doing that. And now with the superhero universes, they found like an endless supply of stories that they can draw from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be interesting to see, how that all changes filmmaking in the future. We have to remember that all of the franchises that we have come to love so much, like Star Wars, only existed because certain types of films were viewed by their creators when they were younger. So Star
Flash
Wars,
Gordon.
yeah, Flash Gordon, the Kurosawa movies.
Yeah. Indiana Jones was inspired by those old Western,
right? The
spaghetti,
old pulp movies, the B serials. So what's going to happen when the youngest generation of filmmakers believes that this is how you're supposed to make a movie? You're supposed to have an entire franchise, and like the financial aspect must be plotted out first before you get into the actual hard work of writing the story and making sure you have a good artistic product.
Yeah.
Overall, I don't think it's a good thing for filmmaking as an art form. I'm glad that it was successful, but I think if Hollywood keeps trying to reproduce the same business model, into the future, it's going to be really hard to sustain it.
Yeah, and I think Marvel's going to be running into a brick wall here pretty soon, because this is the end of I think they're on 20-something films now, and this is what they started out. Their end product was Infinity War. That's going to come out in another year or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the vast majority of people are going to be like, okay, so that story's done, right? So I don't have to, why am I going back to watch another Marvel movie? Because they already had Infinity War.
Yeah.
They have Peter, Spider-Man, which is always going to be popular. So they might have him. I think they're trying to move into the next phase with Brie Larson as Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll work. I have to see how good that movie is. If she'll be able to carry the franchise the same way Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans did. Because Chris Evans probably gone. Robert Downey Jr. is probably done after this. Hemsworth might have a couple more in him, but I'm not really sure. We'll have to see. There's no real news on that. Yeah. So, but yeah, like you said, going forward, what are new movies going to be like? I think you're going to have your Hollywood blockbusters with them constantly looking for that. That franchise, that bankable franchise. I think the indie movie industry is going to explode in the next 15 years or so. We're going to have people who don't want to make a franchise. They just want to make a one-off movie. So they go and they get a studio to give them, $100 million or less than $100 million or something. And they can just move forward with that. They do their little artsy-fartsy project and they put it out in the world, and it hits or not. Doesn't really matter because they're not losing money. And then they just kind of move on and they'll do their projects like that, where I think it's going to be two separate worlds as far as indie developers and Hollywood developers, and which is kind of already the case. And I think Hollywood is moving forward and looking for the streaming service, which is going to be huge. Yeah. Disney has a streaming service. WB wants a streaming service. Everybody's going to be looking for that. I want to make a show. I want to put it on a streaming service so that I can get people to pay a monthly subscription every month and watch my content. So Netflix has it. You got Disney pretty soon. You got HBO with Game of Thrones. They're hugely successful. I think, and then the stay-at-home theater now with what they had that thing. It's not Movie Pass. It was something else where you pay $50 a month and you get to have movies downloaded to your home.
Oh, wow.
Instead of at the theater.
Right.
And, people that have multiple kids like you and I, we don't have to drag the whole family out to the movie theater. It's going to cost a fortune. Plus you got to get the kids to sit down for an hour and a half, 2 hours at the movie theater and be quiet.
It's almost $100 for a family of 5 to go see a movie.
Yeah, it's
nowadays.
crazy expensive. So I think if the industry itself might move forward into the more streaming service where, we put out this new movie and it's going to be available on our streaming service. You can pay however much money to go see it and just watch it in the comfort of your own home.
It'll be interesting to see if movies sort of mimic the popular music industry where you have a revolutionary type of music and then it becomes mainstream and something supplants it. You had jazz and then jazz turned into swing and big band and rock and roll supplanted that. Then rock and roll turned into mainstream prog rock. You got punk rock and then you got hip hop after that. I think you're right. I think there is going to be an explosion of indie movies sometime in the next decade or so. It's going to be a good thing overall because, like you said, the biggest problem with all these franchises is that they're trying to figure out the style first without writing the actual story. That's always a bad thing. It should be integrated into the process of making the film, but it should never be sacrificed for the story itself. I mean, look at how many different ways you can, portray, these classic stories like Death of a Salesman or Wuthering Heights or the Shakespearean plays. You can switch around the context and the style, but the story itself, doesn't change. The story is the central part of it that you just build the world around. And
that's one of the huge failings of the current Lucasfilm right now, because George Lucas, he had that story. He had it already, and it was that classic hero's journey. He already knew what he wanted to happen to the characters for all 3 films, whereas opposed to Lucasfilm with their way of thinking is they had J.J. Abrams write this new one, and J.J. Abrams is the mystery box guy, loves having setup and not have to answer the questions. That's he's known for that. And then they had Rian Johnson come in and do the sequel, which, in my opinion, didn't have anything to do with the first one, really. It was the same characters, but nothing really matched up. And you can totally tell that the overall story was never plotted out for them. They went with each director can do their own thing, and then we'll just tell a story, and it'll just move forward like that. But they never gave them any kind of solid direction. I think Rian Johnson had free reign. J.J. Abrams pretty much had free reign to do whatever he wanted. There was no real cohesive story that they wanted to tell with this new trilogy. And that's to their detriment. Bob Iger has recently admitted that it was too much, too fast. We had some mistakes, so we're going to kind of slow down a little bit, which is a good thing. I'm happy with that outcome. So we'll see going forward. But is there anything else you wanted to add? We're at about an hour and a half, so that's perfect timing.
Wow. No, that's it. I think we covered pretty much all our thoughts on this.
Okay. Yeah. Remember, people, we don't hate DC. We just want it to be better.
Because we love DC.
Because we love DC. And we don't hate Star Wars. We just want it to be better.
Exactly so.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much for listening to the Salty Nerd Podcast, Episode 6, Cinematic Universes. I appreciate the viewers. Hit me up on Twitter at Salty Nerd or Instagram at Salty Nerd Podcast. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.